Welcome to the Diverse Minds podcast, where we give you the tips, tools, and techniques you need to be a mentally healthy and inclusive leader. Each week, you'll hear about a variety of topics linked to mental health, well-being, and diversity that will enhance both your professional practice and personal well-being.
Welcome to the 247th episode of the award-winning Diverse Minds podcast. And this month's podcast series focuses on Mental Health Awareness Week or month. And I'm focusing on setting the framework for positive mental health conversations at work. Last week, I talked about starting mental health conversations as a manager. This week, I'm talking about managing boundaries as a mental health supporter in a managerial or non-managerial role. Speaking of mental health, have you watched my TEDx talk? It's about the connection between culture, race, and mental health in the workplace. It's something you can watch in your break as it's just 12 minutes long. The link is in the show notes, but I'll also give it to you here. It is bit.ly/TEDx Wolves, WOLVESLO. And I really hope you enjoy it because it was a labor of love. And if you enjoyed it, please leave a positive comment on YouTube, share and like. Also, don't forget to connect with me on LinkedIn, Facebook and Twitter. So earlier this month, I delivered 2 mental health first aid CPD continuing professional development sessions at the Francis Crick Institute. And these sessions were really interesting because they were focused on boundaries, how boundaries help both the person supporting someone with mental ill health or poor mental health and the person being supported. And it's not always easy to think about boundaries or know what boundaries are. And it's not very easy because we want to help and reduce someone's mental anguish. But essentially, what are boundaries? And there's been a lot of talk about this. And again, I've kind of mentioned this through the series, but I think that Gen Z are very good at thinking about boundaries and talking about boundaries, perhaps more than other generations, older generations. But essentially, boundaries are limits we identify for ourselves. They're applied through both action and or communication. And it's about creating ways, if you're a mental health supporter, to help within the role, but also protect well-being. And of course, these boundaries are going to be influenced by the environment we work in, how they're spoken about, what the frameworks are, policies and procedures. Now, if you're a mental health supporter, it's really important to understand and maintain appropriate boundaries. It's a key part of successfully providing any kind of mental health support and keeping yourself safe and well. If boundaries are not maintained, there is a risk or significant impact on the well-being of both the person supporting someone experiencing mental distress and the person who's doing the supporting. And if the boundaries aren't clear, whether someone who needs support or who's being supported by a supporter, what can happen is it can create a kind of dependency on support. And so that can be very unhealthy and then very difficult. And we might be trained in providing first initial mental health support or conversations. That does not mean that we are mental health practitioners. And I certainly am not. So I'm very conscious about this. And there have been times where I've been in the workplace where actually I think I've gotten too involved. And that's why I really like to think and talk about boundaries. And also signposting is key. And the other thing to mention is that, of course, boundaries are very culturally dependent, and culture being the culture that we grew up in terms of a family or the people that were responsible for us, country culture, diaspora culture, then our career trajectory culture. And we don't often really sit down and talk about boundaries in a really clear way. And I think particularly in, white British culture, it can be, boundaries about saying, no, I'm not doing it. But actually boundaries are pro-relational. And I've been doing a lot of research and work about this in my personal life. And boundaries are not there to say, no, I'm never doing this. Boundaries actually have to be flexible, but the inflexible bit is what we will and won't tolerate and our values within that. And that's the thing with boundaries. We can't just learn a script or reel off a set of phrases. We have to consider where our internal limits are, and they will vary depending on the situation, culture, and circumstances. And in most non-medical situations, it's really important to be aware of this so we don't overextend ourselves and we can end up doing more harm than good. I guess a parallel example would be where people say, oh yeah, I can coach, and they don't have a qualification. Now that's not to, make people spend loads of money and have a qualification. That is actually about when you do the coaching qualification, you learn about what the boundaries are within the coaching framework. And that's very important because coaching is not counseling. Now, there are people who are trained as coaches and trained as counselors, but you have to be very clear around what you're providing to the person or the people in front of you, because coaching certainly isn't counseling and it's not meant to be. And when you're trained as a coach, we are very carefully trained to say, actually, I'm going to draw the line here because this is going into a counseling boundary and I am not equipped to do that. Well, I certainly do that anyway. So I really hope you're enjoying the content of this podcast and want to keep up to date. Then why not join my newsletter? When you join, you'll receive a free copy of my white paper on inclusive language and mental health. And that link is at bit.ly/ILMHCK. All right. So, I've talked about boundaries. So what can we actually do? How do we show boundaries, especially if we don't know someone and we really want to help? So the first thing is that knowing that active and uninterrupted listening is a gift you can give someone. And by listening and not jumping in, that is a boundary, because what we're saying is my role as a supporter, I'm here to listen. I'm not here to give all the answers. I'm not here to provide the solutions. And I should have said this before, but before we even start listening, it's that whole balancing confidentiality, safety, and appropriate escalation. Now, if you've done any training with me, you'll know that I talk about this quite a lot, which is anytime I've had a conversation with anyone, particularly in my role where I was supporting disabled staff, or it was sensitive conversations with line managers, I would always say, I'm really happy to have this conversation with you today. The conversation we have today is confidential, except in the case of harm to self, harm to others, fraudulent, or any other criminal behavior. I've never had someone get up and say, oh, no, well, I'm not going to talk to you then. We have to do this because also in the workplace, we have to also escalate things. So this is really important. And I think maybe a lot of mal or bad practice could be avoided if people use that, and there was that's a kind of boundary. This is what we tolerate in the organization, and actually I'm not equipped to do X, Y, and Z. Now, some people will be, some people can do that. But if we think about physical first aid, when you do a physical first aid course, even if it's the full 4-day one, you are not a qualified medical practitioner. You are there to do the immediate physical first aid. So that might be putting someone in the right position, stemming blood flow, but we don't start doing surgeries. And equally with mental health support role, we don't start delving in, we don't diagnose, we don't have prescriptions, we don't do any of that. We don't action the Mental Health Act. That's just not what the role is. But the role is, I can see you're in distress. I can see this is a crisis situation. I need to do the appropriate escalation. So it's being really clear about that. Then it's the active, uninterrupted listening. Acknowledging as well, if someone doesn't take action, that is their choice. Now, this is very, very difficult. We can only be the supporting listening ear and signpost and look at the options and provide reassurance. We cannot make someone, that classic phrase, proverb, whatever you want to call it, you can take a horse to water, but you cannot make it drink. That is not our responsibility. And actually, this is where the escalation could be, well, this is, if it's a crisis situation, you have to call the next of kin, whoever's on the emergency contact list, actually is a better way of phrasing that. We can't, drag someone kicking and screaming to do that. And then following that, being mindful you cannot solve something for someone, but you can provide that reassurance and information. You're not on your own. This is very common. People have felt like this before. We have resources in place. And I mentioned culture and mental health perspectives are really linked. So you might be having a conversation with someone and feeling really frustrated. Why don't they just go speak to someone? We have to remember that people may have tried to do that and had their fingers burnt. So it might be a situation around poor mental health linked to disability discrimination. And maybe they went to seek support and the person that they spoke to, the professional, did not understand their particular journey and they spent loads of time explaining it. You see it with racism, you see it with LGBTQIA+ perspectives, international perspectives. So this is really hard. And I think if you can, in that situation, if you do the active and uninterrupted listening, that really is very important. Making the shift from feeling you always have to be there for that person. So it goes back to the point about being the dependent relationship and signposting to resources. That is really, really important. And moving from a kind of rescuer style. So if you do any training with me, we do a lot on the Karpman drama triangle around being into the rescuer role to the supportive adult coaching mode. So realizing that this is a really tough position for someone to be in, it usually is, but that there will be, even though they may be very difficult and not very easy choices, there will be some kind of choice to be made. So do they want to speak to someone? Do they want to take the afternoon off sick? Micro choices, but choices nonetheless. So we don't rescue. It might be that someone is so unwell, and I had a situation where someone collapsed on the floor and I had to take them to occupational health. They couldn't have done that themselves in that moment. That is fine. There are times where we have to do that, but also I informed people what I was doing, where I was going, and I phoned up ahead. They were only one floor above me, but to the occupational health team, so they knew. So I was doing it on my own, but I wasn't really on my own because I'd informed people. And I'd said to this person, what would you like to do now? And actually, she did come back to work and she said, you know what, I know that I had a sort of breakdown, but I can't really remember what happened. Thank you so much. And actually, she got a promotion and she went on to do great things. And that was all her. But what I'm saying is that, you know, it's very important to escalate that. There was nothing else I could have done in that moment. And I tried to have the conversation and asked open questions, and they just weren't in that place. So remember that in a crisis situation, you do need to call for help. If it's a non-crisis situation, we can ask questions around what's helped before, what's been useful. And don't forget last week's episode and other episodes on listening to support, episode 97, and also how to start a conversation about mental health. So I've worked with lots of clients on this area and really looked at boundaries, consistency, because if people have been trained in different ways as mental health first aiders, and it is about getting the fear taken away. And don't forget, there is also my Mentally Healthy Line Manager program, 1 day, half a day, or 1 hour intro workshop. And if boundaries in mental health is a subject you'd like to know more about, I run workshops, training sessions, and keynotes for organizations to upskill and equip your staff and teams. So please do get in touch about how I could help at Leyla, Leyla, at diverseminds.co.uk. So don't forget that boundaries are vital for mental health support. Need to say that again. They help the person supporting and also the supportee. If we don't do this, then crises are far more likely. And also there needs to be a conversation in the middle and top levels of an organization as what the boundaries are for us as an organization around mental health support, and being really, really clear about the signposting internally and externally. And remember that boundaries are pro-relational, and it's not about saying, no, this is the line and the line never moves. But we can't learn scripts. We have to be flexible. We need policy and procedure input. We also need to listen to our gut. And remember, we are not rescuers. We have to think about the supporting, the listening, and the signposting. So I really hope you've enjoyed the show. And if you have, please leave me a review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast from. And don't forget those episodes, episode 97, The Art of Listening to Support Someone, and episode 124, How to Start Conversations About Mental Health at Work. And I look forward to catching you in the next episode, where we'll be wrapping up this series for Mental Health Awareness Week/Month. Thanks again all, and you take care. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the Diverse Minds podcast. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you access your podcasts from. You can also connect with me on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Tune into next week's episode of the podcast, where I'll bring you more insights on mental health and inclusion. Bye for now.